What if you could do more, do better, and do it all in less time? Surprisingly, to make that happen, you just might have to focus more instead of multitasking more. Stay tuned, because I'd like to talk about multitasking and your multitasking abilities and help you determine if you're really as effective as you think you are when you try to do it all at once. This presentation was originally designed as part of the Bright Talk Summit for Inside Sales Professionals. And as an inside coach to sales professionals, I have noticed something, a big disconnect. Inside sales professionals often think they're masking the multitasking that they're doing while they're on the phone with their buyers. But as a researcher, when I talk to buyers, I got to tell you, they can spot your multitasking. They know exactly what's happening, and they don't much care for it. So inside sales professionals, this is for you because your buyers are noticing that something's going on. But this content, it's appropriate for anyone in sales or, frankly, in any role where you've got multiple demands that you're juggling. So if you're listening here at Bright Talk, though, be sure to download the bonus attachments. There in the resources in that tab that says attachments, you'll find a few things there. You'll find a special offer from my good friend Lynn Heidi. She is with Up Your Telesales, and she's going to give you some easy access to some opportunities that she's got for you to help you focus more. But also what you'll find there are some of our favorite books and resources specifically for inside sales professionals. Now, by the way, I'm Deb Calvert. And for those I haven't had the pleasure of working with and meeting before, let me give you a brief introduction. I'm the author of the bestseller, Discover Questions, Get You Connected, and of the award-winning blog, Connect to Sell. I invite you to link up with me, whether it be on Twitter or Google Plus or LinkedIn. My handle for all of those is on screen along with my email address. I conduct sales coaching, sales training, and sales research, as well as working in the leadership space. And those two disciplines converge in my current work, which you may know is the movement to stop selling and start leading. It, like most of my work, is based on research directly with buyers and with sellers. Now, back to multitasking. I think the first thing we need to do is describe what we're really talking about when we say multitasking. You will be relieved to know that I'm not going to advise against doing some joint tasks simultaneously, just like you do right now, but there are some important distinctions that I want to make. So to understand what's helping you work efficiently and effectively versus what you might be doing that's problematic. And after we frame that up, we'll talk about the reasons that we all multitask, what the research tells us about multitasking, why this topic matters at all, and finally, what you could continue doing and what you should stop doing if you want to be more productive in your work. All right, so first, though, that definition, in its broadest sense, multitasking refers to those times when you are doing more than one task at a time. But for the true definition of multitasking, we've got to consider two variables. And the first one would be that you are looking at two or more independent or unrelated tasks, and you're trying to do those two unrelated tasks simultaneously or concurrently. And when you think of it that way, please note, I'm not referring to doing two related tasks like entering data into your CRM about the same client that you're currently talking to. But if you're entering data about the last client or the next client while talking to the one on the phone right now, that would be multitasking. See, those are tasks that are unrelated to each other and not dependent on each other. And then there's also this element, as I said, of concurrency. There are three ways you could think about this facet of concurrency when you are handling tasks. So you could be working on multiple tasks sequentially, meaning that you finish one task, and when it's finished, then you move to the next task. And that's not multitasking. Instead, that's actually a best practice. And that will be our baseline as we compare the other types of multitasking to a better way of doing things. Sequentially is the one that is proven by research to make you the most effective and the most efficient. So more to come about that. But multitasking would be when you are working in parallel. That's where you are attending to two tasks at the very same time. I actually call that juggling because it's hard. And there's this high degree of concurrency. You're doing multiple things simultaneously. An example, I found myself doing this just last night, cooking dinner, talking on the phone, and watching the news all at the same time. We are able, or at least we think we are able to do these things in parallel. I would just want you to know that there are some costs that come along with doing things in parallel, so stay tuned for that. But then this third type, the thing that actually is happening most often with multitasking, it's known as interleaved work. And this is where you are suspending one task before it's completed to jump over, to move to another task. And sometimes that's voluntary, oftentimes it's involuntary. We're forced to suspend a task before it's completed because something has happened and we think we need to attend to another task. And this term, interleaved, it refers to those situations where you abandon one thing and go to another and then come back to the first, and you're bouncing back and forth, sometimes multiple times, back and forth, between two or more tasks. If you frequently check your email throughout the day, you are interleaving. You're leaving one task, looking at your email, going back to the task, looking at your email, and so on. And as I already said, sequential completion of tasks is proven to work best. It's not always possible to do things sequentially. I get that. That's why we need to talk about multitasking. But it's the gold standard. And the in-parallel task work, well, it's virtually impossible when any real concentration is required. If you're trying to do one thing but you're thinking about something else, that's not always too successful. So this parallel tasking, that's generally done with menial tasks and rote work. But just know that even in those instances where you're on autopilot, you won't be able to produce the same volume or quality of work as you would if you were doing it sequentially. And as I said, interleaving, that's the most common thing. And I observe this happening a lot in inside sales. It's actually nearly a constant throughout the workday. So that's why I'll mostly focus on that for the duration of this webinar. And this is the kind of multitasking that you want to minimize as much as you possibly can. The reason to eradicate or at least minimize interleaved multitasking is, frankly, that it doesn't work. Now, we think that multitasking works, and we even think that the ability to multitask is a positive trait. But the truth is, and this is based on extensive research. I'll tell you more about the research because it's pretty interesting, but multitasking, interleaving, simply doesn't work. But I understand why we all think it does. We get a ton of mixed messages about this. For example, I look at the job postings for inbound sales reps and SDRs, and I see a phrase like this more often than not, right within the job posting that says something like, must be good at multitasking. And when I see that, I just cringe. I know the people writing those ads, they actually mean something more like, oh, must be able to work efficiently to handle a high volume of tasks. Or maybe they mean must be able to conduct a conversation while also entering data, which is, of course, in parallel work versus true multitasking. But the problem is that this is fueling the wrong behaviors, the ones that research tells us don't work. So I just wanted to start here with the myth that multitasking is virtuous. It isn't virtuous because it doesn't work and because buyers notice it and they have a negative reaction to it. Now here's the science behind my statement, my audacious statement that multitasking doesn't work. You see, mentally, there are processes attached to everything you do. And when you're working on a task that requires thinking or remembering or even the lowest level of concentration, your brain has to do three things. First, it has to process what is happening and what needs to happen next. And second, your brain has to store data and input to progress through the steps and put the pieces together. Cognition, understanding, is made up of these little bits of data being stored and processed to form conclusions. And then third, if what you're storing bit by bit can't be retrieved, well, then it won't make sense. So you need the steps in your process. Let's say it's a 5-step process. You need your brain to retain steps 1, 2, 3, 4 so that step 5 mentally makes sense and has context. Now, each of those three things, processing, storing, and retrieving data, those three things are happening inside your brain in a different neural pathway, literally in a different place in your brain. Let me see if I can give you a visual so you can picture how this works. Let's say you're walking on a narrow path in the deep woods, and there are lots of paths in those woods. You don't want to get lost in a maze. You want to stay on that path that will get you to your destination. But something keeps forcing you off that path and onto another. You're constantly displaced. You have to find your way back to the right path over and over and over again. See, with multitasking, each time you suspend one task and then try to resume it a little bit later, that's what you're asking your brain to do. And no matter how many breadcrumbs you leave, this is inefficient. And you will, at times, you will lose your way because of all those paths. Well, not only that, but the disruptions interfere with something else. See, when you're switching between neural pathways, your brain can't lay down tracks that last. You're interfering with the encoding or the mental process that builds lasting memory. In other words, you make it impossible to retain all the information you need to be good at the task that you're suspending and resuming. And what that means in your day-to-day work is that you will be constantly backtracking on the pathway and rebuilding those little bits of data, those bits of memory. Or the alternative is that you'll have to proceed without them, and by doing so, you'll be operating without all the information that you need. And that's the fact. These are the consequences for multitasking, the consequences that disrupt the cognitive function in the ways I've just described. Now, the folks who study this stuff, like the cognitive psychologists who study the mental processes that are occurring with varying levels of multitasking, here's what they find. Consistently, by the way, they find that you are going to be distracted. You will be unable to get into the flow of your work anytime you're multitasking. And this constant switching back and forth, it has the greatest negative impact. So Madeline and Gopher, they found that if you juggle tasks simultaneously, you can increase your level of mental arousal and you can mobilize some additional cognitive resources and more brain power to handle those increased levels of load. But those increased load levels, they come from remembering what you abandoned when you resume the task, and then you have that task switching, which even though it's energizing and kicking your brain into high gear, for a short period of time, that improves performance. And by the way, it feels really good because you're energized. But that continued displacement, that heightened mental arousal, it all has a cost. Even if you get a short-term benefit, it's impossible to sustain it. The improved performance that you get short-term is lost if you continue switching tasks. Your performance over time, and I don't mean a lot of time, but it's impaired. And the problem is that we don't realize when we've crossed over from that point where we've improved performance to suddenly we've impaired performance. That point of diminishing return comes quickly, but we're just too close to see it. And this matters for a whole lot of reasons. Let me just give you two. This matters because you lose human presence. You know, I said buyers notice this. One of the first things that they notice talking to a salesperson on the phone who's multitasking, one of the first things they notice is that you aren't seeming human. You seem a little clinical or even robotic. Certainly you seem distracted. They're noticing all of those things, and they're counting it against you because they don't feel that you're trustworthy, that you're paying attention to them, that you really care, that you're tuned in. They notice, and they feel that there's something between you, and there is, those other tasks that you're doing. But there's also a real cost, a measurable cost, a cost to multitasking, and it's a big one. This is a number from U.S. companies, and it's because of the lost productivity, the need for rework due to errors, and all the missed opportunities that add up. And this is what the research from multiple sources tells us is going on that adds up to that very, very big figure. You see, if you measure the impact of multitasking in these two ways, accuracy and productivity, we can see lots of direct correlations. The direct correlation between the amount of task switching that you do and how accurate your work is, for example, or the amount of times that you're switching tasks, going back and forth, bouncing. That also is able to be looked at in a way that it corresponds to the amount of work that you're completing. Now, productivity, by the way, that doesn't factor in accuracy. That's separate. Only the amount of work completed, whether it's right or wrong, good or bad. Now, there's all sorts of tests about this, and they include a wide variety of tasks and combinations of tasks and time frames. But no matter what, the findings are very, very consistent across demographic groups, across the type of task, whether it's mental or physical, and so on. These findings are extremely consistent, and they tell us a few things. First of all, they tell us that people who are high multitaskers, the ones who do the most switching back and forth, they have the lowest, by far lowest levels of accuracy or quality in the work that they do. And they find also that the people who do a medium amount of multitasking, they actually have the highest rate of productivity. They produce more. But remember what I said, this is just the level of productivity. It isn't about right, wrong, good, bad. But they do produce more if they're medium multitaskers. But the people who are low multitaskers, they have the highest accuracy, and they have almost as high a rate of productivity as the medium multitaskers. So, yes, fully acknowledged. Research says you can complete more work if you do some multitasking. The problem is that it will have a higher rate of errors than if you did less multitasking, and you will have almost as high a rate of productivity with that higher rate of accuracy if you are one of the low multitaskers. So for you, you'll have to think about the kind of work that you do, right? This choice. Maybe it's dependent on the kind of work you do and the impact of making errors in your particular position. But by and large, I personally prefer to get a little bit less done and to have a high quality standard with less rework and less of my time being spent on having to redo that work. Now let's talk about on an individual level. What's happening to you when you multitask? Dr. Mike Hostetler at Cornell University did some research about this, and his conclusion in the study that he did was that multitaskers were as impaired, equally impaired, as people who blew a 0.08 blood alcohol level. So what the research says, the full body of research tells us that people who multitask are 40% less productive than those who do less multitasking, and you make 50% more mistakes when you're multitasking. So those are some pretty compelling numbers, but let's tackle a few more myths. There are more myths about multitasking out there, and you might certainly be skeptical still despite all this research, so let's keep on going with those myths. There is a myth that says, yeah, but I'm really good at multitasking, and some people are. Right? Depending on the source, depending on the study, the findings tell us that 2 to 3%, and only 2 to 3% of people are exceptions to the rule. In other words, about 98% of us are not very good at multitasking. No matter what we think, we have to accept that these complex activities that require attention or concentration or focus simply can't be effectively completed by 97 to 98% of us. Now, psychiatrist Edward Hallowell found that, in case you were wondering, yes, more of this 2 to 3% happen to be women than men. So that's not a universal truth about all women, but of the super taskers, the ones who can more effectively multitask, it's true that more of them tend to be women than men. Well, that's the myth of exception. Maybe you're an exception, maybe not, but there are some additional myths that we need to tackle. Maybe you think that the more you do multitasking, the better you're going to get at it. But actually, just the opposite is true. The more task switching you do, the less able you are to focus. You become more and more susceptible to distraction. And that includes being distracted by even irrelevant stimuli. Additionally, the more multitasking you do, the more habitual it becomes, and you become less capable of appropriately regulating your work habits. And then you become less productive, and you become more prone to making mistakes, and you erode your own effectiveness. So this is totally a myth, and so is this. Some would tell you, you might believe, that if you have skills in multitasking, if you're demonstrating multitasking, that means that you are just a better thinker or a better problem solver. But just the opposite is true again. People who do more multitasking are far less creative. They don't invest time in thinking and imagining because they're so focused on simply doing. Their work and their thinking becomes fragmented. And this takes a steep toll on problem-solving abilities. Now, that myth about being on autopilot, because maybe if you're experienced in a certain task, you think you could perform it just as well, whether you're doing it singularly or if you're doing something else at the same time. And sure, there may be a little truth to that, but we probably shouldn't assume that we can do that. You should probably take a closer look at whether or not that's actually true. Because you might be surprised at the level of accuracy and the level of productivity you have if you test yourself. So give yourself an opportunity just to experiment with this. Now, one more myth on this particular slide, and that is that people who are of a certain age group are better at multitasking than others. And I think this is actually more about the fact that millennials and younger people, they do grow up with multitasking being more of a constant in their lives. But what research tells us is that doesn't make them any better at it. At best, we could simply say that they're more comfortable with it, and they tend to be a little more tolerant of the mistakes and the lost productivity that comes along with it. But in all fairness, right, we also have to say that the most natural outcomes of multitasking are more acceptable because multitasking is more acceptable in this generation. It's more expected. So I don't mean to imply any sort of generational laziness or lack of ability. These are sort of the new norms, if you will. Except, and this does seem like a good place to point out what Georgetown professor Cal Newport and others have found, which is that multitasking actually dumbs down our brains. Jumping from task to task results in a false sense of accomplishment, but there's actually a drop in IQ, a measured drop in IQ following an extended period of multitasking. And those drops, they're equivalent to what happens when someone is sleep deprived. MRI scans, so this is even physically measured, MRI scans show that there is permanent damage done to the brains of chronic multitaskers. There's less brain density in the areas that control empathy and emotion. And on top of all that, multitaskers become addicted to the instant gratification that comes after completing small tasks, like even sending an email. Now, there's another myth, and this might be the biggest myth of all. You might be telling yourself that you do your very best work when you're multitasking. And it may feel better when you're multitasking, but even the 2 to 3% of super taskers, those 2 to 3% who can do this, they're not doing a better job. They're not more productive. They're not more accurate. At best, they're equally capable when they're multitasking compared to when they're not multitasking. And for all the rest of us, scientifically measured, we are doing our worst and certainly not our best work when we multitask. We tell ourselves this lie. We justify our juggling because we live in a constant state of hyperstimulation. And for us, maybe it seems like doing just one thing is boring. And we're surrounded, all of us, we're surrounded by signals and people who suggest that multitasking is expected of us. And yeah, we do feel better. At least initially when we're multitasking, it feels good. It feels like we are taking on the world and conquering it. But we're poor prioritizers as we're multitasking. We're letting the tyranny of the urgent swamp us. And societally, we seem to favor busy over effective. You know, it reminds me of the old Aesop's fable, the tortoise and the hare, where looking busy and feeling busy, jumping from one thing to the next and moving fast, all of that, though, eventually slows us down. It causes fatigue. We end up having to do rework, whereas slow and steady, that's what really wins the race. And if you factor in that IQ research and know that your IQ is 10 to 15 points lower when you're multitasking, you're losing productivity, you're not getting as much done, you are making more errors, and so the quality of the work isn't as high as it was, well, certainly then you're not doing your best work when you're multitasking. And this last myth, this one is also imposed by societal norms, by workplace cultures, by misunderstandings even. And that is the belief that you have to multitask. You don't, right? You might be expected to concurrently work on dependent and related tasks, but we've already established that that's not what we really mean when we say multitasking. You ought to keep doing those bundled tasks together. Don't stop. But make the distinction between those situations and the ones when you're bouncing back and forth. You don't have to do that. You don't have to go back and forth. Of course, there will be exceptions, right? There are always emergencies, but work to break that habit so in your day-to-day you can be more effective. Because you are not expected to hopscotch between tasks. I would just about guarantee it. And if somebody is telling you you must bounce back and forth, then I would challenge you to push back and offer improved results in exchange for permission to do more work in a sequential and focused manner that actually works and will improve the output, the amount of work that you do, and the quality of work that you do. And here's how you'd proceed. If that's what you want to do, the way that you would do that is, well, just as simple as it sounds. You would start by getting really good at paying attention. Attention, that means focusing enough to truly connect to the situation or the person or your own internal cognitive process that you need for understanding. And the benefits of paying attention, they're like a stepladder, right? From attention to full awareness and understanding, from deeper understanding to being able to be in control, and with that control that all comes from focus. the ability to quickly get desired results in both productivity and quality. And that's what we're aiming for here. But there's one more benefit, certainly worth mentioning and calling out, and that is the way that this will feel for you. Increased attention, the ability to focus and to do tasks with dedicated focus actually creates much higher levels of job satisfaction. So that little buzz, that adrenaline rush that you're getting from multitasking, if you can break that habit and begin to do something else, sustain focus, getting into the flow of your work, it is much more gratifying and will help you not to be as burned out when you have those little bursts of adrenaline that come and go throughout the day. Now, let me explain flow. This comes from Dr. Csikszentmihalyi at the University of Chicago, and you've probably heard this term, being in the zone or in the flow, before. What this refers to is when in your work that you're doing, the level of challenge that's required is equivalent to your skill level, or the challenge is just a little bit beyond your skill level, so you do need to concentrate and focus. And when you do, you get in the flow. You see, if you get into a place where the challenge is much, much higher than your skill, well, that's the panic zone. And if you get to the opposite, where you have a lot more skill than what the work requires, that's the drone zone. That's boring. But when you match these two things up, and you are able to give your full attention to a challenge that is equivalent to or just a little bit beyond your skill level, what happens then is that it feels good. When you're in the flow, your work is pleasurable for you. And the highest achievers in any field, sports, any sort of competition, any sort of achievement, that leaderboard in your office probably represents this too. The highest achievers are the ones who spend the most time in the flow zone. Their work feels good for them, and they are able to perform at a higher level. These two things go hand in hand, and they never, ever happen with constant multitasking. It's impossible. So it is a choice that you make, and if you're interested in making that choice, here's how you might like to get started. I should tell you, this isn't easy to do independently, but with some time and attention, you can do it. As a field coach, it's easier for me to spot this in others than it is for them to recognize in themselves what's happening. So the way that you'd audit yourself is to tally this up. All you're going for here is some awareness at the beginning. You'd be looking to count throughout the day, or just try it for even an hour. Count the shifts. How many times in an hour do you suspend and resume different tasks? And again, remember, as I said, this includes even checking your email, answering your phone, doing anything that's unrelated to the task that you started with. And that back and forth every time you shift, that counts as one tally mark. And then count the habitual distractions. If you are someone who looks for those stimulants, like I got to check the news, I got to check my voicemail, I want to check my texts, my emails, if you're constantly, habitually letting those distractions creep in, instead of setting a time, let's say at the top of the hour when you make those checks, and only then do you make those checks, then you want to count those separately from the shifts. So you're going to count your shifts, count your habitual distractions, and also count how many times you end up backtracking. And mentally, if you think about this, you know when you're backtracking. You remember, oh, I calculated that, what was it? Or, oh, let me go back and reread that. Any of those backtracks in a typical hour would get a tally mark too. So ask yourself these three questions, and you can be pretty certain that the number you come up with will be less than the true total. That's okay, right? You're just going for a benchmark and some awareness to help guide your next steps. When I work directly with salespeople, my aim as a coach is to help them recognize when the multitasking and habitual distractions are encroaching into their productivity and into their peace of mind during the workday. But you are in this mode, so it's harder for you to recognize it and to be able to make a shift away from it. It all starts with awareness, though. So do this to get a sense of what's really going on, to understand how this is actually stressing you out more than you might realize. And then hopefully you might feel motivated to look for an alternative, to do something about this. And what would that alternative be? Well, here's what you can do about that. You can take these 4 steps. Each one of these is relatively easy, but it does require some practice. It's habits that you're breaking as well as new habits that you're forming, so be kind to yourself as you do this. The first thing would be to start putting things in sequence. And there's no right or wrong sequence. Whatever sequence you pick is just fine. But you'll break down your tasks and you'll differentiate one from another. Let's say a separate task would be to follow up with emails you promised that you would send to your prospects. So in sequence, you make all of your prospecting calls, and then you come back and you follow up in sequence with those follow-up emails. And you might look at that differently, and that's okay. Maybe you decide that you're going to have 10 prospects that you follow through completely on, and you call them, then you follow through on the email, and you enter that information in your CRM, and you close out on that prospect before moving on to the next one. Well, that's fine too. The point here is that you do it all sequentially and in the way you predetermined, as opposed to sometimes doing it one way, sometimes doing it another, not really having a deliberate plan in place. Your predetermined sequence and sticking through to the completion of each task in sequence is what counts and what makes you more effective. Secondly, I mentioned this already, but what if? Indulge me for a moment. What if you checked your email and your voicemail at the top of every hour instead of compulsively checking it dozens of times throughout the day? For most salespeople, this dramatically improves productivity, and it has absolutely no detrimental effect whatsoever on customer satisfaction or on response times for the things that you need to do. So at least try it. Before you say no, at least give it a try. The third thing you can think about doing is, it's impulsive. It's reflexive even, the way that you might be responding. So before you make those shifts, check yourself. Make sure this isn't just a false sense of urgency. Ask yourself, before I make that shift, is it really necessary? Usually it's not. If you think this through, you'll often decide not to shift right now, but to plow through with what you're doing and come back to that new thing. And this one habit alone can make you extremely good at time management. If you decide not to shift unless there's a reason to do so right now, so shifting is the exception rather than the rule, then you'll find that you're able to sustain focus and complete tasks faster with better quality the first time through. And then finally, one more thought for you as you're thinking about how to do this, and it's really just about disciplining yourself to think about the way you look at your tasks. See, lots of things you do are kind of related. Let's say you get on the internet to do prospect research, and then you see an email that catches your attention, so you respond to that email, and that reminds you, oh yeah, somebody else wanted that same information, so you go ahead and send them an email too. And then you update your CRM for both of those activities, and then you take a call because, well, you're in between tasks anyway, so you might as well. And pretty soon you've forgotten why you ever jumped online in the first place. See, those tasks, they're not really related, and they're certainly not dependent on each other. You've allowed yourself to fall into a trap of shifting and to succumbing to habitual distractions. And what you're doing there, remember, you're losing your neural pathways. Your brain is now having to jump, and the breadcrumbs aren't sufficient to get you back on track. Your productivity and your accuracy have undoubtedly been compromised. You've done less than your best. So just building this habit of staying in command of your shifts, it matters. It makes a difference. It does take practice, but it's really refreshing when you get to that point where you can be more deliberate in what you choose to focus on. Now, as we're closing out this topic, I want to review the advantages. The advantages you'll have if you make a commitment to do less of the multitasking that's counterproductive. If you'll build those 4 habits I just described, you will make more sales. And I can say that with a high degree of confidence because I've seen so many salespeople do exactly that. And you'll feel better about the work you do, even as you're doing more work in less time. And you'll be pleased with, proud of your work, and you'll more often find yourself in the flow as you're working. And at the end of the day, you will feel less drained. And you'll feel smarter because, in fact, you are. Maintaining focus keeps your IQ higher, and that is far more rewarding than the short-term adrenaline surges that you get from juggling. So I encourage you to try this because that increased amount of work getting completed, the decreased number of errors, the decreased amount of rework, the higher degree of job satisfaction, the reduction in mental fatigue and brain strain, and most important of all, the better connection that you'll make with your buyers that they will notice and reward you for, because they'll appreciate it and they'll know that you are right there with them. All of this, it adds up to improved sales results. Now, if you have any questions about this, I hope you'll let me know. My social media connection is on screen. My email is deb.calvert@peoplefirstps.com. Let me know what questions you have because I really hope to see you use this, and I'd love to hear about your success stories too. And don't forget that we have some bonus resources for you in the attachments file. Those were compiled by the team here at People First Productivity Solutions, specifically for inside sales professionals. And Lynn Heidi added a bonus for you in there so that you can begin to focus, and she's got a process that will help you complement the work that you're doing as a result of this webinar. And one more thing, Lynn Heidi and I are going to be doing a blab session about multitasking on June 1st. So we'll be talking about a natural build-out from the content that we've described here. And we'll start talking more about those replacement behaviors that will make you more effective. I hope you'll join the blab and that you'll bring some of your success stories, the things that you have been doing between now and then, almost a month from now, because you came to this webinar. Thank you very much for being here. If you have any questions, please don't forget to be in touch with me.